All right, everyone, welcome to classical conditioning. So in our introductory video, we learned that Ivan Pavlov is one of the most famous people in psychology because he's credited with discovering classical conditioning. So originally he studied salivation and digestion, but he eventually stumbled upon classical conditioning while he was experimenting on his own dogs. Pavlov discovered that a totally neutral stimulus, like a bell, which should not elicit any sort of natural stimulus in a dog, when he paired that bell with a stimulus that should produce a natural response in a dog, like meat would cause a dog to drool, they would be excited to eat it. When he paired those together enough times and presented them to the dogs together, eventually, when he just presented the bell itself, it caused that natural drooling response to the bell, which should never happen biologically speaking. So let's kind of unpack what that looks like, because as I mentioned, these same principles influence our phobias and taste aversions and other types of learned behaviors in you that you might not have thought about before. So classical conditioning, it's a form of learning in which a previously neutral stimulus, meaning it doesn't evoke a reflex in a learner, eventually acquires the power to elicit an innate reflex that's produced by another stimulus because the learner learns to associate a relationship between both, and then their body anticipates future events. So that all sounds like a bunch of mumbo jumbo to you. Let's unpack it a little bit by looking at some specific terms related to classical conditioning. So little Pavlov, while he was studying salivation in dogs, he found that salivation from eating food, which is a totally natural response. And here in the video, you can see Mrs. Van Fleet's adorable dog, Alfie, completely drooling a waterfall of drool because Alfie is about to get food itself, okay? But Pavlov realized that that natural response eventually started to be elicited from stimuli that never should cause that response in dogs. His dogs would salivate when they just saw food, or when they saw their dog dish, or even when they saw the person who normally brings them the food, or just by hearing that person's footsteps. And he got very intrigued and he thought, why are these dogs producing this natural salivation response linked to food itself, to this other random stuff in the world that should never cause that response in dogs? And here's what he found. He noticed that the dogs salivated, which is an unconditioned response, a natural response, to various stimuli associated with meat. The meat is something that actually should cause the dogs to salivate. So then on purpose, he paired a completely random stimulus like a ringing bell that has nothing to do with a dog getting fed whatsoever. And after several repetitions of pairing the bell with the meat, he found that the dog salivated to the sound of the bell alone. So before learning occurred, before the experiment, before the conditioning took place, the dog is naturally going to salivate when it's presented with food. And it's not going to salivate at all when it's presented with some random tone or a bell sound. But during conditioning, you can see on the left bottom corner there, when the tone is repeatedly given to the dog with the food in succession over and over and over again, and the dog's now drooling to both, then eventually, just when the sound itself is presented, the dog is going to drool. Okay, so let's unpack this vocab a little bit. Let's talk about unconditioned stimuli and unconditioned responses. So an unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that triggers a response naturally before or without any conditioning. Okay, in this case, the unconditioned stimulus is the yummy dog food. It's something in nature that causes a natural response. The unconditioned response is that the dog salivates. It has no control over it. It's a reflex. It naturally happens, okay? The same thing can happen to you, right? If you see a package of Skittles, that could be an unconditioned stimulus that causes you to salivate, and you don't really have control over that. Your body's learned that it's sour, and so it's going to start salivating just when you see those Skittles or anticipate eating them. The unconditioned response, like I mentioned, is the response that naturally occurs, again, without any training. It's automatic, it's reflexive, like salivation. So we have these things that are happening in nature, the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. Before learning occurs, before conditioning happens, a neutral stimulus is a stimulus that does not trigger a response in the learner. So before any sort of conditioning would occur, if you shake a bell at a dog, it's not going to drool because that doesn't happen in nature. However, during conditioning, if you pair a bell or any neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus that naturally causes a drool response, if you do that over and over and over and over again for multiple trials, now the learner is drooling in response to both objects, so that eventually this neutral stimulus becomes what we called a conditioned stimulus. It used to be neutral, but now it's conditioned because presenting it alone causes this conditioned response of salivation in the dog. Let's make sure we follow the changes there because this can be a complex process. The unconditioned response and the conditioned response, they're always the same response. They're just triggered by different events. And the difference is whether conditioning was necessary for the response to happen. Okay. So drooling to meat is an unconditioned response in a dog. No learning has to happen for that response to occur. Drooling to the sound of the bell is a conditioned response because learning the association between the bell and the food had to occur to elicit the drool response to the bell. Okay, so a couple more things just to sink in here. So an unconditioned stimulus reflexively produces an unconditioned response without requiring previous training. Any food is going to cause salivation. A good test for determining if you're looking at applied examples, whether a behavior is an unconditioned response, is to think about whether any member of a particular species would exhibit the same exact behavior from birth without any learning having to occur. Like all of us would salivate in response to like a lemon being placed near us or Skittles or Sour Patch Kids or something like that. Other examples of unconditioned stimuli and responses would be placing food in the mouth always causes salivation. A super hot environment always causes sweating. A really loud sound always causes a behavioral sign of like startling or fear, things of that nature. A conditioned stimulus is a stimulus that has come to elicit a conditioned response only because the learner learns to associate the conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. Those are paired together over and over and over again. And now this conditioned response to that item alone is elicited. So some examples, a neutral tone can be paired with food, and that causes salivation to both, so that eventually if you just hear the tone, you're going to salivate. A real life example would be if you repeatedly use a scented hand sanitizer just before you eat lunch, eventually when you just smell the hand sanitizer, you might actually start to salivate because your body has learned to associate the smell of that sanitizer with the idea that you're about to eat. Another example would be if you ever experience a terrifying event that happens to occur in the dark of night, you might eventually develop a fear of the dark itself, even though there's nothing to fear about the dark itself, just something terrible had happened to you in the dark. That's how phobias are developed as well. And so we'll talk about that more in class next time. Okay, so just to reiterate these stages of learning when it comes to classical conditioning, before learning occurs, we have a natural stimulus that produces a natural response in a learner. We call those the unconditioned stimuli and response. During learning, we are purposefully pairing together two stimuli, an unconditioned stimulus and a neutral stimulus. And we pair them together over and over and over and over again until eventually the previously neutral stimulus becomes conditioned to elicit a conditioned response to it alone. And that's how classical conditioning works. When we talk about the acquisition phase of learning, what's getting acquired? What's being learned is an association between two stimuli, the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. Okay. If you guys have ever heard people talk about a learning curve, here is an actual learning curve where a learner is presented with two stimuli together over and over and over again until eventually a new response is being learned to just the conditioned stimulus alone. Just like we can acquire a conditioned response when two things are paired together, if we stop pairing those two things together, the learner will unlearn the association, aka learn a new response. So for instance, with Pavlov's dogs, he eventually stopped pairing together the bell with the food. And eventually, the dogs learned, oh, well, now my food just comes. It's not linked to this bell. And when Pavlov would randomly ring the bell, there was no conditioned response anymore. It extinguished. It was gone because the learner learned a new association that these stimuli are not paired together anymore. Okay, so we have acquisition, which refers to learning that the two stimuli are paired together. We have extinction, which refers to learning that they're no longer paired together, and then there's no longer that conditioned response. We also have something interesting called spontaneous recovery. So in Pavlov's experiments, once he extinguished the drooling response in the dogs, every once in a while when he would ring the bell, the dog would drool. And he's like, what is this about? And so he called it spontaneous recovery, that following a rest period, presenting a bell or a tone alone might actually lead to a return of the conditioned response despite a lack of further conditioning. But eventually that response is going to extinguish if you don't continue to pair the stimuli together. Lastly, we're going to talk about discrimination and generalization. So in classical conditioning, discrimination is the ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimuli and other similar stimuli that actually don't signal an unconditioned stimulus. So in Pavlov's case, if he rang a whole bunch of different types of bells around the dogs, but they only drooled in response to the one bell that was paired with food over and over and over again, they would be discriminating. To the extent that they would drool to all different types of bell sounds, then they would be generalizing. Okay, so Pavlov with his conditioned dogs, generalization again would be that more and greater number of bells or whatever the stimulus is elicits the response. Discrimination means the learner can pick out, I'm only doing this response to this particular stimuli. And we'll do a lot more applied examples of this in class, you guys, next time that actually have to do with your real life that you'll find more interesting. We're focusing a lot on Pavlov because they're going to ask you questions about him on the exam in particular, and he kind of sets the foundational knowledge for all of these concepts that we'll take further in class. Okay, couple of applications of classical conditioning. Advertisers know that this happens, and so a lot of times they will play amazing music and put pleasant photographs around their stores to make you in a great mood so that you're more likely to buy their product. In taste aversion conditioning, the conditioned stimulus is a new taste that gets paired with you becoming sick as the unconditioned response if it's paired with like a toxin or a bacteria or something like that. And then in the future, you learn to avoid that particular taste. And then lastly, let's talk about John Watson and his super shady experiment with little Albert. So there is little Albert in real life sobbing because he's terrified of white rats because he was conditioned to feel that way. But basically, Watson wanted to determine whether people, like dogs, could be classically conditioned. They can. And he also wanted to show that a lot of emotions and behaviors are actually learned. They're not genetically hardwired into us. So sweet little Albert, who previously was not afraid of white rats or white fluffy objects, left this learning experience being terrified of them for the rest of his life. And not only did he fear the white rat, but he feared all other furry little white items. His fear generalized to other similar stimuli. So let's look at how this went for him. You can go ahead and watch this really brief YouTube video. It's a little bit sad, but you'll see the conditioning in action. But basically, before learning occurs, the white rat is the neutral stimulus. It doesn't provoke any sort of response in the baby whatsoever. However, the unconditioned stimulus that produces a natural fear response is this really loud noise. So Watson would basically, during the learning phase, he would bash a hammer against a loud tin thing and then put the white rat in the baby's lap. And he did that over and over and over again. He paired the noise, the rat, the noise, the rat, the noise, the rat. And the baby is now terrified of both things simultaneously, so that eventually, when he just presents the rat alone, the baby is now freaked out beyond belief of rats. And eventually he gets scared of other white furry objects as well, because his fear generalizes. So when it comes to something like the Albert experiment or Pavlov's dog experiment, here's a really classic example of a question that you would see on the AP exam itself and likely on our unit exam as well. So it says, little Albert learned to fear a white rat after repeatedly experiencing a loud noise as the rat was presented. In this experiment, what is the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the neutral stimulus, and the conditioned response? And here then you would have a multiple choice where you would need to pick out, what is the unconditioned stimulus or the conditioned stimulus, etc. So in this experiment, the unconditioned stimulus is the loud noise, because it naturally, without any learning having to occur, produces a fear response in most human beings, right? The neutral stimulus, which becomes the conditioned stimulus, is the rat. Before the rat was paired with this awful noise, it didn't elicit any sort of reaction in Albert. Only when it was paired with that natural stimulus to produce the fear response did it eventually become conditioned. And the conditioned response to the rat itself then, at the end of the learning experience, was fear. Okay, so we're going to pause the video and I'm going to invite you to complete all of the practice examples in your interactive notebook. Go ahead and do your best effort on those. I will give you credit for simply completing them, but please take time to do your best. And then when we come back to class next time, we'll go ahead and work through those examples to review at the start of class.